Shalom, Mubaraka, Mashpacha, peace and blessings, family. In this video, we're going to talk about something a little bit different here. We're going to be talking about who truly wrote the book of Genesis. It was not Moses. Okay, let me just say this. It's time for us to let go of the whole idea that Moses wrote the same Torah that we have today. Moses wrote the law, statutes, and commandments on the original Torah scrolls, which no longer exist today. Those Torah scrolls were copied repeatedly, and what we have is a version of Torah that contains the laws as well as some history added to it. You understand? It's time for us to mature and become realistic here. Moses did not write about his own death in the book of Deuteronomy. Okay? He was not speaking in third person in the whole book of Exodus. So, what was going on in the book of Genesis? Because I can't tell you who wrote Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, but I can tell you exactly who wrote the book of Genesis. Let's debunk the idea that Moses wrote Genesis. Let's debunk that. If we go to Genesis 14:14, it states, "And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. So we know that Moses did not write Genesis because during Moses' time, there was no established tribal territories yet. The tribe of Dan and his location did not exist during the time of Moses. This came during the latter days of Joshua. So Moses could not have wrote Genesis because Dan did not have a territory yet. Just that right there proves Moses did not write Genesis. Also, I'm going to prove to you that Joshua did not write Genesis, that none of the judges wrote Genesis, and Genesis had to have been written sometime during the dynastic period, during the kings of Judah. So let me prove that. And when I say kings of Judah, I'm not talking about during the time of Saul. I'm talking about after Saul. So let's prove that for a second. If we go to Genesis chapter 20, verse 7, it states, "Now therefore restore the man his wife, for he is a prophet, and he shall pray for thee, and thou shalt live. And if thou restore her not, know thou that thou shalt surely die, and all that are thine." So Abraham is called a prophet. Abraham is called a prophet in the book of Genesis. But if we go to 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 7, it states, "Then Saul said to his servant, But behold, if we go, what will we bring the man? For the bread is spent in our vessels, and there is not a present to bring the man of Elohim. What have we?" And the servant answered Saul again and said, "Behold, I have here at hand the fourth part of a shekel of silver. That will I give the man of Elohim to tell us our way." But then the writer of 1 Samuel gives us some context. It says, "Before time in Yasharal, when a man went to inquire of Elohim, thus he spake, Come and let us go to the seer, for he that is now called a prophet was before time called a seer." In verse 10, "Then said Saul unto his servant, Well said, come let us go. So they went unto the city where the man of Elohim was. And as they went up the hill to the city, they found young maidens going out to draw water, and said unto them, Is the seer here?" So basically the writer of 1 Samuel used the word seer. But they understand that the word seer would probably be unfamiliar to the reader. So he had to put some context before he said the word seer. He had to give some context that that's what they used to call prophets. During the time of Saul, they did not call prophets prophets. They called prophets seers, because the word prophet or nabi is a new word. It was a word that was used in the Hebrew language after the days of Saul, not during the days of Saul or before, which means since the word Nabi or prophet can be found in the book of Genesis, it could not have been written during the time of the judges, it could not have been written during the time of Moses, and it could not even have been written during the time of Saul, because at that time the word Nabi did not exist yet, which only leaves the possibility that the book of Genesis was written sometime during the dynastic period of Judah after the days of Saul. Okay? So, with that being said, with all the history and knowledge that can be found in the book of Genesis, if it was not written by Moses, who could have wrote Genesis? Well, when we go to the book of Wisdom of Solomon, which is a book that they took out of our scriptures, in my next video, I'm going to tell you why they took this book out of our scriptures. I need to introduce you guys to this amazing book, by the way. Wisdom of Solomon differs from every text that is found within the manuscripts of what we call the Tanakh, because all the other texts are written to the common man as well as the nation of Yasharal. However, the book of Wisdom of Solomon was actually written to the kings of the earth, because Solomon was a king of kings, king of all the kings of the world. So in the book of Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, verse 16, it says, "For in his hand are both we and our words, all wisdom also, and knowledge of workmanship. For he hath given me certain knowledge of things that are, namely to know how the world was made." Namely to know how the world was made. So Solomon says Yah gave him certain knowledges, namely how the world was made, indicating that perhaps people during Solomon's time did not know how the world was made. They did not know all the details of how the world was made. Solomon is the one who gave Yasharal the exact details of how the world was made. Just before that, they knew that the world was made in 6 days, but they didn't know any other details about that. They didn't know what exactly was made on the first day, the second day, the third day, the fourth day, the fifth day, the sixth day. So Solomon was the one who gave that knowledge to humanity. It said, "And the operation of the elements, fire, wind, earth, water, etc., spirit, ether, all the elements, Solomon knew the operations of them and how to use them." Verse 18, "The beginning." Oh, so Solomon also lists the beginning as something that Yah gave him as knowledge. Can anyone guess what beginning is in Hebrew? Bereshith, which is the same name for the book of Genesis in Hebrew. So Solomon is basically saying that Yahuwah gave him the knowledge of Bereshith. So it said, to know how the world was made, and the operation of the elements, the beginning, ending, and midst of the times, the alteration of the turning of the sun. So also, wait, the turning of the sun. So he was also an astronomer, and the change of seasons, the circuits of years, and the positions of stars, the natures of living creatures, and the furies of wild beasts. So he was also a zoologist. The violence of winds. So he was also a meteorologist. And the reasonings of men. So he was also a psychologist. The diversities of plants. So he was also a botanist. And the virtues of roots. So he was also a medicinal herbalist. And all such things as are either secret or manifest, them I know. Solomon was also a historian. He was also a very good architect. He laid the blueprint for the Holy Temple. He was good with mathematics and more. Solomon chose the cedar of Lebanon to build the temple because the redwood of California is fire resistant. Its sap prevents it from catching on fire. Yes, you can still burn a redwood tree, but nowhere near as easily as any other wood on the earth. And Solomon knew that, and he knew that because of all these wars, let me build this temple out of something that's not going to burn down easily. Yet the Babylonians still came and found a way to burn it down, right? So he was just being smart. He said, let's use the most fire resistant wood. It's not completely fire resistant because, of course, the cedars of Lebanon catch on fire all the time. But you got to understand adaptation. These trees adapted to years and years and years of forest fires to the point where they're actually fire resistant for the most part. They don't catch on fire easily like other trees would. Anyway, Solomon had all that knowledge. But he said how the world was made and the beginning. Solomon got that knowledge from Yah. So with that being said, if we know Genesis was not written during the time of Moses because of the tribal territory of Dan, if we know that Genesis was not written during the time of the judges or Saul because it mentions prophet or Nabi, it had to have been written after Saul. Now, who after Saul had the knowledge to be able to write the book of Genesis? Had to be Solomon. 1 Kings 4:34. And there came of all people to hear the wisdom of Solomon from all kings of the earth, which had heard of his wisdom. All kings of the earth. So all the kings of the earth was learning from Solomon. And did you guys also know that Solomon created world peace? During the time of Solomon, the kings of the earth was not warring against each other. Reason why is because David told Solomon before he passed away, look, my son, you are to establish peace because this temple cannot be built if there's any wars in the land. Solomon knows that he can't control these other nations to make them stop going to war. But Solomon did understand through cunningness, he could create peace. And he had to do something that he knew in his heart was wrong. Marrying women of all these nations. Solomon knew marrying into certain nations was horrible. If you go into the book of Proverbs, every time it talks about strange women, it's given in a negative connotation, indicating that Solomon understood beforehand that being and engaging in relationships with these women of other nations was not a good idea. However, Solomon did it anyway, and I'm going to tell you why. Because Solomon wasn't marrying any random strange women. He was marrying the royal women of other nations, the daughters of kings. Now, this is very important. And the reason why this is very important is because this actually prevented wars from happening, because Solomon by default became the prince of all nations. If you marry the princess, you become the prince.
If Solomon is the prince of all these nations, technically all these nations became one. So it's easy to prevent wars from happening if it's just one nation.
Which worked. It allowed the temple to get built. It allowed the temple to be established for a while. But Solomon ended up becoming complacent and lenient towards these women. Psychologically, that took a toll on Solomon. Over the time, all these women telling him, let's build an altar to Moloch. Solomon said, no, for 20 years straight, 30 years straight. But eventually, he just did not have the energy to argue with these women anymore. He said, go ahead and build these altars. That's why Solomon lost it all, because he became complacent and ultimately weak. It's never a good idea to be lenient with Torah. It can cost you a lot. If you think about it, whoever wrote Genesis had to have known all the nations of the earth. You can't just write Genesis with 70 nations in it and not know about 70 nations and their lineages. So he must have had to have conversed with these kings to get some intel on who they descend from. So with that being said, again, Solomon wrote Genesis. It's very simple. Who would have knowledge to write something like this? And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted and became into four heads. The name of the first is Pison, that is, it which compasseth the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. There is bdellium and onyx stone. And the name of the second river is Gihon. The same is it that compasseth the whole land of Cush. And the name of the third river is Hiddekel. That is it which goeth toward the east of Assyria. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. So Solomon knew about all these rivers, what lands they compassed, what minerals, resources, and plants can be found in those regions. So you got to understand, this wasn't a normal guy who wrote Genesis in order to know. Just between Genesis 2 and 10 and Genesis 2 and 14, you have to have some type of experience to know, oh yeah, the gold of that land is good. That's some good gold over there. And also there's bdellium and onyx stone. So you're dealing with somebody who knows the land and has probably had experience with extracting resources from that land. You're dealing with somebody who's powerful. You're not dealing with some, average scribe. And then in Genesis chapter 30 and verse 37, Solomon talks about Jacob and the things that Jacob did. Let's read it. And Jacob took him rods of green poplar and the hazel and chestnut tree, and peeled white strakes in them, and made the white appear which was in the rods. So Jacob took branches of green poplar, hazel, and chestnut trees, and he peeled back the bark. Okay, he peeled back the bark so that a little bit of the sap can be exposed, right? And he set the rods which he had peeled before the flocks in the gutters in the watering troughs, when the flocks came to drink, that they should conceive when they came to drink. So basically, Jacob created a medicine for his sheep. If your sheep cannot get pregnant, if your sheep are barren, take green poplar, hazelnut branches, and chestnut branches, peel back the bark, and put it inside of the water where the sheep drink out of. And the sap combines, creates a medicine so that when the sheep drink it, now their womb can open up and they can have children. Whoever wrote this text, not only would they have to have known intricate details of history of Jacob, because this is very personal thing that Jacob would have did, but they would have also had to have knowledge of herbalism, medicinal herbalism, just like we learned Solomon was a master of. But yeah, Solomon wrote Genesis, man. It's just plain and simple. That's just some knowledge that you can take home, do whatever you want with that. But yeah, Solomon wrote Genesis.